and I'm the co-founder and CEO of Vanta. Vanta helps startups get secure and then get through compliance audits like SOC 2, HIPAA, and ISO 27001 in weeks, not months. The idea for Vanta came, like so many do, out of personal experience. Prior to Vanta, I was leading the PM team at Dropbox Paper. We were trying to act like a startup. And so we were moving fast, breaking things, and trying to get paper to market for the very first time. We were really enthusiastic, and we were convinced that we were going to be bigger than Dropbox if we could only get the product to market. But that was the first step. And so our go-to-market was pretty simple. It was just go get all the Dropbox users. And we were about ready to do that when we ran into a really big roadblock. In our efforts to move fast, we realized that we hadn't actually adhered to Dropbox's security commitments. And part of that was we didn't have a SOC 2. So we had to stop. And it was going to take about a year of our team's time to fully meet those security commitments and get that SOC 2. So this was all taking place around the time of a slew of high-profile data breaches. Like, if you can remember back to 2016 and the election, when everyone's emails were everywhere, and Equifax, when everyone's social security numbers were everywhere. And it was becoming clear that security wasn't something you could afford to put off until you were a big, high-profile target. It was something you would have to do from the start, and particularly to go to market. So in 2017, I co-founded Vanta with the idea that you could get startups to start on security early and build secure products from the start. We also realized that if you did this, you could help these startups unlock new deals, move up market, and ultimately compete on a more level playing field with other big incumbents. So we started in 2017. And by the end of 2020, we'd almost hit $10 million in ARR and helped over 1,000 companies, startups mostly, secure themselves. And we hit that milestone without raising a Series A, just on our seed round. We felt this pull from the market and saw this huge opportunity in front of us. It seemed like what we were doing and our approach to the market was resonating. And so in May of 2021, we decided to raise our first Series A, and a first round of institutional funding. It was a $50 million round from Sequoia. The decision to wait until we passed $10 million in ARR to raise our first venture round didn't happen by accident. But also, if I'm being honest, it wasn't our original plan. When Vanta left Y Combinator in the winter 2018 batch, so March of 2018, we were going to do like the standard startup plan. Series A at $1 to $2 million in revenue, Series B at 10 million, and so on. And so we left the batch thinking we'd do that, and we felt really good. We'd hit our revenue milestones, raised a seed round, and we're so confident that we paused all sales so we could go try to hire our first engineers. Continued to feel good for a few months, did hire those engineers. But then about 9 months later, a YC partner pulled me into their office and said we were way off track. That most of our peers in the batch had gone out, kept building their businesses, also been able to recruit somehow at the same time, hit $1 million in ARR, and we're driving up and down Sand Hill Road. And we hadn't, and it was already 9 months out, and we were behind. And so I left this partner's office really freaked out, probably appropriately freaked out, but really freaked out, but sort of resolute about one thing. I didn't want to pitch Vanta then. I didn't want to pitch it without the full confidence that it deserved, and that we could go, rather than thinking about fundraising, and start to concentrate on building the business. So that's what we did. And particularly, instead of slide building, I spent a few time doing a few other things. First, talking to customers, trying to sell to them, figuring out, trying to explain Vanta in my words, seeing what they said back to me, and then like rinsing and repeating with the next call. Selling the product. Some of those, at the end of those conversations, someone would ask me for an order form, and you're like, oh, right, that is why we were talking. I will mail that over to you. And then third, growing my own conviction that we were solving the right problem with the right approach. And so we did that, and about 6 months later, we did hit that magical $1 million in ARR. And sort of revisited the topic of fundraising, right? Like now we were back on track, felt good. Went back to that partner, and he was like, yeah, I kind of knew you'd be fine. I was trying to scare you, which is very effective. Again, thank you, Aaron. But when we revisited the topic of funding again, like something in me had shifted. We were actually operating at basically cash flow break even. We didn't need to go fundraise. Felt really clear-eyed about the opportunity in front of us, and felt like we can go spend that time building a slide deck, or we can just keep building the business and see how far this will take us. And so I want to stop briefly for one moment and say, this isn't a talk about not raising money or how venture is bad. And if you walk away and think like Christina hates all VCs, that's not true. I actually started my career at an early stage venture firm, Union Square Ventures in New York, and it's great partners that I respect tremendously. And we now obviously have a really great long-term partner in Sequoia. But waiting to raise did in fact have a lot of benefits for Vanta. First, we had to rely on organic word of mouth to acquire customers. We just like literally didn't have the bank account to go spend a bunch on paid marketing. And I think this ended up being a really good litmus test for product market fit. Second, we had to be disciplined about spending and instill that discipline across all parts of the company. We literally used to put the bank balance in front of everyone on a weekly basis just so we all knew how much we had. And that on its own created a bunch of discipline. And then third, it forced us to think about whether we had a good business and we liked our business, and not whether some VC really liked what we were doing. And so I'm a huge believer in this approach. And so today, I'd like to share with you 4 lessons I've learned over the past few years of building Vanta. And I hope they're helpful to you, whether you're building an IPO-ready company or just a proper cash flow positive business. So with that, lesson number 1, the market always wins, AKA build something people want. So if you're starting a startup or thinking about it, you probably have pretty good intuition and an idea that people want what you're building. But also really helpful to validate that, somewhat obviously, and if you can, validate that before you write any code or start building. And so for me and Vanta, this was really important. And honestly, it was so important because over the last decade, prior to Vanta, I have written a lot of code for products that absolutely no one wanted. Well, it felt really good at the time, and I felt super productive. Slamming into the reality of no one wanting the thing was not so fun, over and over again. And so for Vanta, the way we validated that we might have something people wanted was initially just talking to other founders. We were talking to them about security broadly. It started with just like, what does this mean to you? What do you do at your company? And then got in, and we sort of realized there are 2 reasons that folks buy security products. The first is to close a customer. We realized that founders are spending a bunch of time answering customer questions, filling out security questionnaires, getting on the phone, trying to get companies that were bigger than them, which in the early stage is kind of definitionally everyone else, to buy their product. And we also realized that if you're going after a big customer, you want to sell to Google or Facebook or Slack or whomever, and they tell you to jump 12 feet in the air, you're going to jump 13 feet. Like, you will do anything to get that deal over the line. The second thing we realized was that security falls in this like low knowledge, high anxiety gap that can be really pernicious. And that people are really worried about it and rightfully really anxious about it, but don't sort of know what to do. And so we talked to some CEOs and CTOs who'd spend time and money on really high-priced security consultants who would write their policies and sort of tell them what to do and get on the phone with prospects. And sometimes this was helpful and sometimes it wasn't, but it was always a ton of cost. And we also found that just more CEOs and CTOs kind of wouldn't do anything. They'd just lose sleep and worry and say, should I be doing something with security? I don't know when to start. What should I do? So with these conversations, we sort of realized that there was a market need here. There was something there, and we felt good. But next we were like, well, what do we kind of do about this? And we kind of had more of these conversations, and we realized that a SOC 2 was sort of the common app for security. If you remember these from applying to college or hearing about it, right? It was like one form that all the enterprises understood and accepted. And so in theory, if a company could just do a SOC 2, they could kind of apply to all the colleges, right? Sell to anyone. And so we figured that if we could figure out a way to make SOC 2 compliance easier and accessible to small companies, we'd probably have a lot of very willing users and customers. But we wanted to make sure we actually understood what a SOC 2 was before we blindly, again, started to write code to automate it, kind of whatever that would end up meaning. And so we got lucky again and had friends at Segment who were about to start thinking about compliance for the very first time. And they didn't have anyone on their team assigned to it and sort of didn't really know what to do. It's one of those nebulous, like, as part of our enterprise go-up market, we'll think about this and figure out what it means sort of things. And so they graciously gave us desks in their office for a few weeks. And at the time, they had just moved into a new office, and so it was, comically large. And the Segment team was in like 20% of the office. And then we were like in the other 80% with all of the free snacks. And so we sat there and ate a bunch of chocolate-covered pretzels and read a bunch of SOC 2 reports. And I probably read about 24 of them kind of that first week. And then talk to Segment and try to talk through and work it out. And what came out of the exercise is literally this spreadsheet. This is literally Vanta's V0. It was a list of all of the things we thought they needed to do for a SOC 2. A red, yellow, green status for each, and scores. This was literally Vanta's V0. And so we handed this over to Segment and then asked them 3 questions. And I'd encourage you all to ask these questions if you're thinking about prototyping something. The first was, what did I give you? Like, what is this thing? Second, would you use it? And then third, would you pay for it? So repeating again, what did I give you? Would you use it? How much would you pay for it? And I would really encourage you to ask your early customers or early users these 3 questions. And if they can't answer them, especially if they can't answer the first 2, go back and keep iterating. And so at this point, again, our product was just a color-coded spreadsheet, but we felt like we were on the right track. We figured out that we could sort of engineerify a SOC 2. We could take a lot of jargon and break it down into component pieces, we call them tests, that could be coded and automated and checked against continuously. People understood it. Segment that, yes, we get it. We would use this. Thank you. And they'd pay for it because the security and compliance problems that they felt were so acute. So that's the first lesson. Build something people want. And no matter how much money you raise, you can't raise your way into product market fit. And it's actually kind of harder because if you have it raised, right, you've got to pivot quickly before you run out of money. And if you have raised a bunch of money, you've got to pivot, but then go back to all these people that you pitched your grand vision on and say, hey, JK, here's vision number 2, let's try this. So either way, raising just doesn't help here. And so as you're thinking about building things, I just encourage you to validate your ideas before you start building them, before you write a line of code, if possible. Lesson number 2, charging annually up front makes everything better. So after you confirm you're building something people want, the second most important tip to scaling is figuring out go-to-market. Just how are you finding customers, how are you selling to them, and then what happens after that contract is signed. One of the lessons I've learned from Vanta is that if you can, charging annually up front just makes everything else a little easier. And this, again, we didn't start out with this. When we first started selling Vanta, we had 2 options. We had an annual option and a monthly option. And that was partially because we wanted to, give people options, buy how you want. Like, we don't even know if our product's all that useful, right? Like, let's not make it harder for you to give us money. And part of it was honestly, we just looked at a bunch of other SaaS pricing pages and realized that everyone else had monthly and annual, so we probably should too. So that's what we did. And it seemed to work. It was enough actually where we could convince a first AE, a first salesperson to join. And he did. And then he immediately stopped offering the month-to-month option. Just didn't give it. He just annual or bust. And we were pretty shocked and pretty scared because what are you doing? At least you're incented to do the right thing, but this is pretty scary. But he came back and was like, look, you guys are creating security automation as a category for startups. And you're convincing startups very early on, founders on a couch stage, that they need to spend money on it. That's hard enough. Then you're going and creating all this other uncertainty in how to buy. And being like, well, once you buy, what's the right option? How do you do it? Answer these 7 questions, right? And so we'd created this product that was meant to relieve a bunch of anxiety, hopefully was in one domain. And then we were creating a bunch of anxiety in how you buy it and kind of how you use it. So we kept only quoting annual pricing. We sort of bit our tongues and sat on our hands to see what would happen. And what happened is deals actually started to close faster. Because again, fewer options, more certainty, they just moved. And in retrospect, I think this makes more sense certainly than it did to me at the time. Just because security is not something that you want to think about on a monthly basis. You're in or you're out. And so by kind of building the product or building the product to go to market as an annual subscription, we're sort of training our customers that this is something they're thinking about all the time too. The other thing we found is that the folks who are actually on annual contracts and monthly contracts used Vanta differently. The annual contract folks, again, used the product in a more continuous way. It wasn't just about audit prep. And so that was a bit of a light bulb moment for me in that we could change a little bit of how people thought of us and used the product with how we were pricing it. I mentioned earlier that charging annually makes everything better, and so a few examples of that that we found. One was that it was easier to think through a customer lifecycle and figure out where they were and ultimately provide better support when we knew somebody was there for an annual basis. So it's been easier on our success team. Second, RevOps, Salesforce automation, all of that, billing just became easier with fewer contract options and fewer SKUs or products that we're offering. And third, revenue itself became a lot more predictable, right? We knew what we were raising, we knew what we had, we knew what was in the bank, and it made it less likely that we'd have to run out and raise real quickly on probably very unfavorable terms to avoid a cash crunch. I also think that annual billing ends up being a good barometer of lesson number 1. Did you build something that people really want? It takes a lot of conviction to ask someone to pay for our product upfront, full year, nearly sight unseen. But if you can pull it off, and if they're pleased with that, it's a very good sign that you're onto something important. And ultimately, if you've built something that your customers can truly see the value in, they'll be okay with annual billing. And it will probably simplify a few things for them as well. Lesson number 3. Hire more workhorses and spend less time searching for unicorns. So at this stage, you've hopefully built something that people want. You're selling it in a way that resonates with them and helps you build your business. And so now the challenge any startup faces is hiring. The most valuable advice I can give on recruiting probably doesn't sound all that great, but it's just that you have to do a ton of it. There's no magic bullet. There's kind of ways to make it easier on the margin, but you're just doing it constantly. In YC, they told us that 50+% of a startup CEO's time should be spent on recruiting. This struck me as sort of absurd at the time, but there's also kind of no two ways around it. You just want to do it. And at that point, if you're actually spending 50% of your time recruiting, you're probably talking to a lot of people who you don't actually need to hire in the next 4 seconds, or more realistically in a startup, like 2 weeks ago. You're building a pipeline of candidates, talking to a lot of people, and I think at the time it can feel a little luxurious, right? There's some task or job you can't wait to get rid of. You know you're bad at it, and so you just want to laser focus on finding the accountant who can fix the books that you've been doing wrong for a year and a half. But if you can also meet a few smart product marketers along the way, that actually ends up being really helpful later. So it's just no silver bullet, but as much recruiting as you can stand to do. And then once you're spending over half of your time recruiting, the next piece of advice is probably a little painful, and that's don't over-engineer your roles. Or kind of look for things that might not actually be there. And I say this is painful because Vanta very much did this in our early days. We were so convinced that Vanta was really special, and it is, but we were so special that normal jobs at a SaaS company like customer success manager or operations didn't apply. We didn't have those. We had special versions of those jobs. And so we created these special jobs that were cobbled together parts of different roles. And then also as part of this, we were meeting people who we thought were really great, we were really excited to work with, smart, motivated, wanted to have a big impact. But they didn't quite want these standard roles and titles either, right? And they were I don't really want to be a customer success manager. And we're yeah, we don't know if we have those, and you're also really good, so let's work out something bespoke. We sort of did that. And we were sort of making these unicorn roles. We were mashing these different pieces together. And one, well, it just didn't work, right? And two, on the other person's side, there was this mismatch in expectations where, they expected this very special thing, and then turns out kind of what the business needed was something that was, more common across SaaS companies. And so here, the idea of Ted Lasso, taking someone who's really specialized in one domain and plopping them down somewhere else makes for really good TV. But I think it just doesn't work in the context of a SaaS company, especially a small one. And so when you're thinking about your early team, especially prior to raising a big round and all of that buzz, it's really important to pitch people on how special your startup is, because jokes aside, your startup is very special. But on the flip side, it's also important to keep in mind all the ways your startup just isn't that special. It's maybe a standard SaaS company. And one of those, namely, are the roles and job descriptions and job titles that you have. And so this list of job titles showing up on the slide right now, literally pulled from vanta.com/jobs. So 2 things. So 1, if you know anyone who's interested in these, would love to chat with them. But 2, right, like very standard job titles, exciting roles, exciting opportunity, but like this is not the place where we're differentiating today on these job titles in particular. And so just overall, would recommend saving your time coming up with these kind of elaborate job descriptions and titles and kind of Rube Goldberg interview loops, which we very much did. And just focus on meeting the best folks you can for roles you need today and roles you think you'll need in the future too. Lesson number 4. Know which problems money can and can't solve. Okay, so at this point, you've got a product people want, you're selling it in a way that works for your customers, and you're building a great team. At this point, you've probably got VCs chasing down your door with term sheets, and that's fantastic. My final piece of advice before signing any of those term sheets is to just be clear with yourself about which problems money can and can't solve. Some of which it can, and some will be waiting for you after your celebratory glass of champagne. And also, harkening back to the beginning, this is not a talk about not raising money. There's a lot of really good reasons to raise before you get to $10 million in ARR. Oops. Good reasons to raise before $10 million in ARR. Namely, if you think something in your industry is about to change, market dynamic, competitive dynamic, something like that. You also might just be hiring really quickly. I mean, we used to joke, but our thing was like, can we hire fast enough to draw down our bank account balance faster, such that we need to raise? We weren't able to pull it off, but like, all the kudos to you if you can. And then the third reason, if you're marketing, if you actually start spending and it ends up being really efficient, if you're, have this machine where, go-to-market machine, where you put in $5 or you put in $1 and $5 comes out, like, then you should probably raise. And those are all good reasons to raise. But I think it's also important to keep in mind that fundraising is at most, or at least, a 1 to 2 month process. And that even in the Zoom Tiger financing era, you still got to do a lot of stuff, right? You've got to put together your narrative, design a deck, stand up a data room, manage this pipeline of investors, make a decision that'll have ramifications on you and your business for years and years, right? It's a lot. And so when we raised earlier this year, I canceled everything on my calendar. And some of it was to do all that stuff, all those tasks. And some of it was also just to enter into this headspace where everything about Vanta was totally perfect. Nothing was unoptimized. So that when VCs started asking questions, you can answer truthfully and confidently, but not with all the nuance of the day-to-day and whatever fun thing is happening that day. And then also, beside that time commitment, again, there's just things like validating your initial product idea, figuring out your customer pitch and go to market that you just can't solve with more cash. And so as you've seen from our story, there are good reasons to wait before you raise money. It helps you better test for product market fit. It instills discipline across the team. And again, it forces kind of conviction and your own team's sense of whether you have a good business, not whether a VC likes your business. And I think both as companies and an industry, and honestly an event like SaaStr, we celebrate the big PR moments. And it's really fun to get your team's photo in Forbes and have your biggest sales week ever because of all the buzz that you generated. But ultimately, that stuff's all kind of fleeting. And you and your team, are with your business one way or the other. And so again, that conviction piece is just so important. And so I'd say when you are thinking about taking on external partners, you want to do it because you have conviction in the problem you're solving, the way you're solving it. your customers and how you find them. And ultimately, the team you've assembled, and ultimately you raise on your terms, not those of a hype machine. And to that point, every startup is different, and they're all hard, whether or not they work, which is part of what makes them so fun. But I hope that some of these lessons are helpful and help you, kind of have a more rewarding experience with fewer battle scars. And so to recap, my 4 lessons for building to $10 million in ARR before a Series A are: first, build something people want. Second, charge annually upfront if you can. Third, spend lots of time hiring